and talk about my sister in that way. I pressed Dad's arm. "Stop worrying," I said, addressing our watery shadows. "That uncle, whatever his name is, he probably doesn't have a clue who we are. I bet he's never even heard of Stella." There. I'd said her name out loud. It dropped through the space between us, with a whistle and a thunk, and we both flinched. I hated how that always happened. Sometimes I'd say her name accidentally on purpose, in the middle of a conversation, just to make us both hear it. One day I thought we'd get used to it, and be able to talk about her in a free and easy way, and she would belong to us again. I would be able to say, "Stella," and move lightly on, instead of feeling like I'd drawn a curtain across the sun. Dad poked me with his elbow as he patted his jacket pockets in search of cigarettes and lighter. He was usually furtive about his smoking habit because he knew I'd tell him off, but he didn't even pretend today, and I didn't say a word. I wouldn't have minded one myself. I was still holding that glass of Prosecco, and I took a gulp while he was lighting up. "Byrne Hall," he said meditatively, after he'd taken his first puff. We looked up the tiered lawns to the pale, pillared house. Wedding guests weren't allowed inside. We were under strict instructions not to stray beyond the gardens, but it made a beautiful backdrop, especially on a hot summer day like today. It was rather austere, with its 3 identical rows of windows and the severe symmetry of its columns and chimneys, but the framing trees and sunlight served to soften the effect. I couldn't have told you what style or era it belonged to, except that it put me in mind of Jane Austen TV adaptations. Later I discovered it was 300 years old and built in the Queen Anne style. I thought about the person I'd be if this were my home, the expansive way in which I'd live and move and think, the poetry I'd write, the light and freshness that would saturate my soul. "I remember that house," said Dad. "I remember seeing it in the distance, when they took me to the cliffs in the Coast Guard boat, and one of the policemen said, 'That's Byrne Hall, that is, our local stately home.' And I said, 'Oh, yes. Nice place.'" I smiled guardedly, and Dad took a vigorous pull on the cigarette, as if it quenched a thirst. "Funny, isn't it?" he went on. "Having such an ordinary conversation at a moment like that." I shook my head and drained the Prosecco to the last drop. It wasn't my first drink of the afternoon, which was probably why the ripples of reflected light in the pond were starting to look psychedelic. I took hold of my father's arm again, as much to keep my balance as to make him stop talking. "You'd think they would have hesitated, wouldn't you?" he went on, "before they booked it as a wedding venue. You'd think they'd have had the odd scruple. Or did they just forget?" A cigarette usually mellowed him, but he sounded bitter now. "I'm sure they didn't mean anything by it. They're only second cousins after all. They've probably forgotten it happened here, if they even knew in the first place. Anyway, it's not the house's fault that Stella died nearby, and it's a good few miles from where they found her." "It's barely a mile." Dad flicked his cigarette end away. It landed on the surface of the pond with a hiss and floated motionless like a dead creature. I watched the last grains of smoke dissolve in the hot air, and tried to concentrate on not falling over. "Litterbug?" I said with a nudge, still trying for a light-hearted tone. He made no answer, so I turned away. One of the guests was emerging into the garden from the cliff path, his hair plastered to his head. He must have been swimming in the sea, and the whiff of salt water on his clothes made me sit on the low stone wall. "The sea," I muttered into my empty glass, feeling hot and sick. I shut my eyes and imagined ice-cold waves lapping at my stomach, darkening my vision,